The settlement numbers used in my examples are just examples. Every case is different. I'm using numbers to help you understand the process. I'm not talking about your case. And just because I'm discussing settlement numbers doesn't mean that your case will definitely settle. It's unlikely, but possible, that we may recover nothing in your case. Therefore, we highly recommend that you do not think about how you will spend whatever monies you may receive as a result of your case. For example, college tuition, home improvements, vacations, cars, new businesses, etc. Results are not guaranteed in any case. So please, don't spend this money before you get it. Hi everybody, and welcome to the video library of Salenger, Kimmel Bavaro. I'm Jeff Kimmel, managing partner of the firm. The topic of this video is what's your case worth? It's something every client wants to know. Some clients ask me point blank in our first meeting, what's my case worth? Others don't ask me in the first meeting, but they're definitely thinking about it. And I don't blame them, because everyone who brings a case like this does want to know what's the value of the case. After all, that's what we're seeking in these cases, money as compensation for injuries. But it's a very difficult question to answer at any point because every case is so different. We've broken down the answer to this question into two videos, and it's really two topics that we'll cover separately, but they're related. So the two things it comes down to is, number one, the strength of the evidence that we have to support your case. And that's the topic I'm going to cover in this video. For part two, we cover the second part, which is how do you put a value on the case? How do you come up with a number? And it really depends on precedent, what lawyers call precedent, which is what's happened before, meaning what have similar cases with similar injuries been settled for in the past. So again, two topics. Strength of the evidence, we'll cover that today. And the next video will cover the value and putting a number on the case based on precedent. Now, each of those has a whole process that we go through, and these videos are going to explain that process. So this first video covers the strength of the evidence. Now, people who come to me in the beginning and at our first meeting want to know, what's my case worth? What's the value? Come on, you can tell me. What are we going to get here? And I always say, I don't know, I can't answer the question because I can't. And some people really push the envelope and they try to pressure me into giving them a number. And they say, you know a number. You've done this. You guys have been around for 35 years. You've had thousands of cases. I see your website. You know. You wouldn't have brought me here if you didn't know what the case was worth. Now, the truth is, I don't know what the case is worth. I bring people in when I think that the case has potential, but there's so much that we have to obtain in terms of evidence, and that's the subject of this video, that I don't know the value, and the evidence changes as the case moves along. And I'll explain that as we go forward. Let me briefly explain what I mean by evidence and what goes into evaluating the type of evidence to determine the value of the case. Number one is fault or liability. Those terms are synonyms in the legal world, fault and liability. And it simply means who's at fault for the accident? Who caused the accident? Was it 100% someone else? Was it 100% your fault? Probably not, because if that was the case, I wouldn't be meeting with you. Or is it something in between where it may be a situation where you're somewhat at fault and someone else is at fault? But that is the first analysis that we have to make, is fault. Second, in looking at the evidence, is your injury or the damages, meaning what injury did you suffer and what damages did you suffer? Because we'll break this down later. The injury and damages mean the pain and suffering you've experienced, the pain from the injury that you've had, and also if you've had a loss of earnings, and if you have not been able to go to work and you've lost money because of that, and if you're out of pocket any money, if you have a spouse and there's a loss of services claim, these are the elements that make up, the damages and the injury. So we have the fault and the injury, those are the first two. And then number three is what we call proximate cause. It's a legal term, but what it really means is just a connection. We have to prove a connection between the fault, the accident, and your injury. Meaning you have to prove that your injury was a result of the accident. Now, at first blush, that may seem obvious. Of course, I was in an accident and I got injured. But in many cases, people who are victims of accidents have had either prior accidents where they've injured the same part of their body, or if they have perhaps underlying conditions where that part of their body has been injured before or is subject to injury because of an underlying condition. These things happen, and because of that, we have to prove that every aspect of the injury that we're claiming came from this accident and not from something else. So those are, in general, the three areas that we're going to cover, and we're going to cover them each one at a time. So the first of the three elements that we talked about with regard to the evidence, the strength of the evidence, is fault. And it's also referred to as liability. So just by way of example, I'll use a car accident to make the point. So if you're in a car accident, we have to prove that it wasn't your fault. So if, for example, you're in a car, you're at a red light, you're completely stopped, and then you get hit from behind by a car, and the driver was admittedly texting on the phone and wasn't paying attention and hit you in the rear. That's obviously a great case, and we can easily prove with those facts that you were 100% not at fault, that the other driver was 100% at fault. That's easy. Now, taking a different example, say it's a car accident and it's an intersection where you are traveling one way and there's a stop sign, and another car is traveling a different way and there's a stop sign, you each have a stop sign, and there's a collision in the middle of the intersection. And you say that you stopped and you went into the intersection and the other person went through the stop sign. And the other person says that they stopped when they should have, went through the intersection, and you blew the stop sign. Now, in that instance, we have to figure out who's right or who remembers it better. So in a case like that, when we're evaluating what's your case worth, we have to consider that, well, a jury may find that you were some percent responsible, because that's what happens. And I'm going to talk about juries and what a jury would do in your particular case, not because your case is necessarily going to go to trial. Most cases don't go to trial. But when we're talking about the value of a case, all parties involved, when we're considering and negotiating value, think about what would a jury do, because if we can't resolve it, it's going to go to a jury. So that's always the analysis. People get nervous when I say, well, a jury would do this, a jury wouldn't do that. I say that because that's what we have to think of when we're valuing a case, because that's how everyone values a case. We think, what would a jury do? That's the ultimate decider of the facts. So if a jury, in the second example I gave, finds that you're 75% responsible and the other car is 25% responsible, then whatever money they award for your injury, no matter how badly you're injured, whatever number they award gets reduced by the percentage of your fault. So if they gave you $100 for your injury, but they found that you were 75% responsible, then you get $25, right? I'm going to do the calculations on paper in a moment to make it easy, but I just want to make the point first so you have it in your head. If it was a 50-50 split, say the jury hears the case and they say, I don't know who's telling the truth here. It could be this person, could be that person. So we're just going to split it and say each driver's 50% responsible. But you're the injured victim and your injury, they say, is worth $100. Since the jury found that you were 50% responsible, you only get half of that $100. That's how that works. So let's take out the pen and paper and put this down in writing so it's very clear and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's give an example here to help you understand this issue of fault and liability and how that affects value. So we're talking about fault, which also is referred to as liability. It's essentially who caused the accident. So we'll use a simple example of a car accident case. We'll draw an intersection here, and we'll say this is the intersection, and that you are in this car, and the defendant is in this car, and each of you has a stop sign, and you go into the intersection, and there's an accident. And whose fault is it? That's the question. So, for purposes of this example, let's now assume that the value of your injury, say you have a broken ankle, say we assume that that value is $1,000. Okay, that's the value of your injury, $1,000. Okay, so how does fault affect value? That's the question. So the way it works is if we assume, or if we say, okay, if we go to a trial and a jury is most likely going to determine that you were at fault because, like I said in the example, the defendant says you went through the stop sign, there's a witness that says you went through the stop sign. So here's what can happen. If the jury decides that you are 100% at fault, that means that you get nothing, okay, because you're 100% at fault. If the jury comes back and says, well, you are 50% at fault, okay, they compromise and they think, okay, well, we don't know who's telling the truth, we're not sure about this witness, and let's just say that both people went through the stop sign, so you're 50% at fault. What that means is the $1,000 is reduced by your responsibility, by the percentage that you are at fault. So that means half of the 1,000 is what you will get. So since you're 50% at fault and the value is $1,000, you get $500. Okay? And then it's just math. If we take the next example and say the jury comes back and says that you are 75% at fault, then your fault reduces the amount. So then you will get $250 because that's 75% of 1,000. And if we take the next and they say you're at 25% at fault, then you would get $750. You reduce the value gets reduced by the percentage that you are at fault. So what this means is when we consider settling and we talk about value, we have to see, okay, how good is the liability? How strong is that evidence? Because if we're confident, say the intersection accident was more like, you know, you're here, and the defendant comes up and hits you in the rear, right? And there's a witness that says, yeah, you were stopped at the stoplight, and they hit you in the rear. So then, in that case, it's clear that you are going to be free from fault, that the defendant is going to be 100% at fault, or at least we could assume that. And in the negotiations and in the discussions, we'll say, well, this is a strong liability case, so whatever your injury is worth, you should get that or close to it. As opposed to this scenario where it's a toss-up, if your injury is worth X we're going to have to reduce it when we talk about what's the value of the case. It's not what's the value of your injury that you get. You get what's the value of the case. So if the liability and your fault reduces the value, then it's going to be reflected in what the offers are and what the settlement will be. Okay, so that's the message. Your percentage of fault reduces the value. So when we consider it, we have to consider what you will maybe possibly be found to be responsible, and that's going to reduce the value of your case. So that's it. So let's look at the next element that we look to determine the value of your case, which is what's your injury? What are your damages? There are multiple things that make up this component. The first one being the most obvious, which is pain and suffering. That means what type and what's the extent of the pain and suffering that you've endured because of your injury. And for that, we look at a lot of things. We see what the medical records show. We see what the x-rays show. We see what the CAT scans show. We see what the doctors have written about your injury. We look at an operative report. It's really how severe is your injury? Was it a sprain? Did you have a fracture? Did you have surgery? Did you have multiple surgeries? Are you going to need more surgeries in the future? All those things make up your injury. And when we talk about your injury, and in these cases, the more extensive the injury is, obviously, the higher the value of the case, right? So if you have a broken bone as a result that heals on its own, that's one thing. If you have a broken bone, you need a cast, that's a little more severe. If you have a broken bone and you have a surgery, that's even more severe. If you have a broken bone and a surgery and they put in hardware and you have to have another surgery to have the hardware removed, that's 2 surgeries, that's even more severe. So as we go along that continuum, the more severe the injury, then the higher the value of the case. Now, let me just point out that all these elements are equally important. So there are some cases where if the injury is severe, but the liability, meaning the fault, is in question, then the case is not worth as much as if you had a very severe injury and great liability. We'll talk about that more in the next video, but I wanted to make that point. All these are connected. We don't look at them individually, but we're analyzing them now individually so I can explain what they are. How do we actually put a dollar value on a pain and suffering award? Now that's difficult. It's not a common thing to say this type of pain and suffering is worth this amount of money. In reality, you can't put any value that makes sense. It's really based on precedent, and that's the next video. So we will get into that question in the next video. Another element of damages is lost earnings. So we can look at lost earnings as another way to value your case. If you're a worker and you've been injured and you miss work as a result, then that would enhance the value of your case. We'd be able to claim that you've now lost earnings that you would otherwise have made because you got injured and you haven't been able to work. So that's, compared to pain and suffering, a lot easier to calculate. You take a piece of paper, you take a calculator, you look at a W-2, and you say, okay, this is my salary, this is what I was earning, I missed a year of work, and this is what I would have otherwise made. And that's fairly easy. It's not always easy, say, for people who have their own business and their personal life and their business life is sort of intertwined. We have to look at that carefully. There are other cases where we'll even hire an economist to do some calculations for us if there are union workers, say, who have lost all kinds of benefits, whether it's pension, whether it's earnings and promotions and things that they would have otherwise gotten. There's a little more of an analysis, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much a calculation that you make based on what you were earning and what you lost. So that also will go into valuing your case. Another element of damages would be your medical expenses. Now, if you have traditional insurance and you have an insurance company paying for these bills, it's usually not a big ticket item, say, in your case that the medical bills have cost X, Y, or Z, but it is an element. And if you have out-of-pocket expenses for co-payments and other types of payments, we would keep track of that, and that would be another element of damages that we would consider to look at the value of your case. In addition, if you are married and you're injured and your spouse now is affected by the injury, which is very common, there could be what we call a loss of services claim. It's for married people where the non-injured spouse has lost something from what the injured spouse used to do. And the classic examples are, if one of the spouses would take out the garbage, do the gardening, do the laundry, or whatever, and now that spouse can't, and either the other spouse had to do it, or you've had to hire someone to help out because you're busy caring for your spouse, whatever the case may be. All those things are compensable. You can get compensated for it, and those things get factored in to the analysis of what's the value of your case. So that's definitely something to consider. Now, I want to bring up the point of divorce, right? There's a whole separate video on divorce, and this is one of the areas where divorce would come into play and maybe affect the value of that element, the loss of services element. So watch that video, because that could affect the value of the loss of services element to your claim. In addition, if the case is a wrongful death case where someone passes away, then there are a lot of special damages specific to wrongful death claims. And I've made a separate video on that as well. So rather than take up everyone's time in this video, I want to keep it simple. If you have a wrongful death case and you're looking for information on that, check out that video, and I'll go into more specifically how those kinds of cases are different and how those elements go into valuing those kinds of cases. And that brings us to the last element of evaluating the strength of your case. We covered fault, we covered injury, and now we have to cover connection or proximate cause. All that means is that there has to be proof that your injury came from this accident. And again, that may seem obvious, but it's not always obvious, because some people who are in, say, a car accident, for example, and hurt their back, say, oh, I got an injury to my back because of this accident, and that may very well be true. And then we find out that that person had another accident, say, 2 years prior, and they hurt the same part of their back. Or they have some underlying condition that makes them suffer from a bad back. They have a bad back, and they've been to the doctor before for a bad back, not because of a car accident, just because they have a condition, whether osteoporosis or some bone disease or arthritis or whatever it may be. And if that is in the history of the client, if that's in the medical records, then that becomes an issue. Not that they didn't get injured in this accident, but maybe, the other side would say, maybe it's not quite as severe as they're saying. Maybe some of that injury that they're feeling is because of their underlying condition. Maybe some of that injury that they're feeling is because of the accident, the similar car accident that they had 2 years ago. So that issue factors in to valuing a case. We have to see, is it clear that there's connection between the injury and the accident, or is it not so clear? If it's clear, your case is stronger. If it's not so clear, your case is weaker. Again, regardless of how severe your injury is, this is the third and final separate element. So we take each element and we look to see the strength and weaknesses of each. And that analysis will give us an idea toward what is the value of your case. So the reason why I can't answer that question of what's my case worth in our first meeting is because some or all of these three elements may change as the case goes on. What do I mean? Let's take the first element, the fault. Whose fault is it? Say you come in with a car accident and you tell me that it was an intersection accident, the other guy went through the stop sign, I didn't. It's his fault 100%. And I believe you, because that's what you believe happened. And I think about your injury, I think about the case, and I say, okay, since it's 100% the other person's fault, your case is worth X. Then what happens? We get the police report, and we see that the police officer wrote in the report that, hey, the other driver said You went through the red light or the stop sign, and it was 100% your fault. That's different. And what if the police officer found a witness at the scene that you didn't know about because you were already taken to the hospital? There was a witness that showed up and said, you went through the red light. That's a problem, and that changes things. So if I've given you a number based on what you've told me, which was the other person was 100% at fault, and then this other evidence shows up, then the number I gave you is probably wrong, and we have to reevaluate it. And here I put a number in your head that you think the case is worth, and I was wrong, and that's not good. What about your injury? Say you come in, you were in a car accident, and you broke your ankle. And you came in and said, hey, the doctor told me my ankle's broken and that I'm gonna need surgery. And this is really bad. I'm gonna try some physical therapy, but it looks like I'm gonna need surgery. And I say, okay, well, we'll see what happens. And you say, no, what's my case worth? And I say, okay, well, if you have the surgery, the case is worth X or Y or Z. And now I've put a number in your head that you think the case is worth. And now what happens is you start treating and hey, you get better. You never have the surgery. Terrific. But now I've told you a number that's not accurate. That's not good. Or the flip side. Say the doctor says you should get better. The doctor says, well, you have a broken ankle, but with therapy, you should be fine. And you come in and you say, look, I broke my ankle, but doctor says I'll be back at work in a few weeks and everything should be fine. What's my case worth? And I say, okay, well, based on that, it's worth X. And then a few weeks go by and you call me and you say, my God forbid, the injury didn't heal. Now I'm going to need surgery. Now I'm going to need this kind of treatment. Now the number I told you was inaccurate. It was wrong. We have to reevaluate it. And that's not good. I've given you a number that you have in your head, and now that has to change. What about the last element, this proximate cause element, the connection between your accident and the injury? Say you come in after a car accident and you say, I was hit in the rear at a red light. It's 100% their fault. And I have a herniation in my back. The doctors sent me to an MRI clinic. I took an MRI. They say I have a herniated disc in my back. What's my case worth? And I say, well, okay, let's say I answer it. I said, based on your age and what happened, it's their fault. It could be worth X. But now, and I say, well, have you ever injured that disc or injured your back before? And you say no. And you say that because you think, I've never been in a car accident before. This is the first time I've been in a car accident and I hurt my back, so no. But let's say we start getting the medical records to see what kind of treatment you've undergone, and we see that you had an accident at work. Nothing to do with a car. Say you were lifting boxes and you hurt your back, and you reported it to your employer, and you went out of work because you hurt your back, and it was a workers' comp claim, which is very different than our kind of case. And you don't remember because it's not a car accident, and you thought I was asking about a car accident or whatever. And we find out that in that workers' comp injury, it was the same disc that we're claiming was injured in this car accident, and the workers' comp injury was 3 years ago. That's an issue, because if I give you a value based on an injury that you never had before, and then we find out you had an injury to that same disc 3 years prior, now it changes the process. It changes the evaluation, because now we have to look and see, okay, what kind of treatment did you get? Did you improve? Were you completely better? When was the last time you went to the doctor for the workers' comp case? There are going to be records from the comp doctors that evaluated you. A lot is going to have to go into separating your back injury from this car accident that you suffered in this car accident from the workers' comp case. And we can do it, and that happens often where people have what we call an exacerbation of an injury. So we can still go forward and get you compensation, but the valuation is going to be different. So if I tell you a number and then find out you had a prior injury, it's a different number. This is why it's almost irresponsible of me to start entertaining answers to this question at our first meeting of what's my case worth. I don't know, because all of these elements can go many different ways. So that's why I'm not going to answer that question, and that's why I don't know the value of the case. But at some point, as the case progresses, I will, and we will have that discussion. So let's take out the pen and paper again and recap this in writing. I want to put this down on paper so you fully understand it before we get to the next video. So taking out the pen, taking out the paper for the recap. Okay, so let's recap this. The question is, what is your case worth? Like I said, we're going to have 2 videos to describe this because it comes down to 2 things. The video we just watched is on the evidence, how strong is the evidence? That's part of the answer to that question. And the next video is going to be on precedent, meaning what have other similar cases gone for, settled for, and we're going to get to that in the next video. So let's recap this video, which was on the evidence. How strong is the evidence in your case? And understand too that that changes. Remember, I gave the example that this could change when more evidence comes in. If the depositions come in and testimony changes, or the police report comes in and it's different. So the strength of the case is something that changes. But let's recap what we covered. What evidence are we talking about to answer this question? So we talked about, number 1, we talked about fault and how that is connected to the value. We did a diagram on the different percentages, and we said that your fault decreases the value, right? And we did a whole video on that diagram, which talked about you being 100% at fault, 50%, 25%, any kind of percent. So we learned that your fault reduces value. So if fault is a question, if it's that intersection accident, then the value is going to be affected. The next thing we covered was the injury. And of course, the extent of the injury affects the value of the case. And we know the extent of the injury based on evidence like medical records and x-rays, and if you had surgery and things like that. So that affects the value. So within this topic, we talked about what makes up your injury. What are the elements of your injury that are considered? We discussed pain and suffering. That is a big element of your injury. We also talked about lost wages, earnings. So when you lose time from work and you've lost money, that is part of your injury, part of your damages. We also call these damages. We talked about medical costs in this subject, and we talked about if you are married, you have a spouse, your spouse may have a loss of services claim. Okay, so these are the elements that make up your damages and your injury. And then the third thing we discussed about what comes into the value of your case is this concept of proximate cause, which is a fancy way of saying a connection. The connection between the fault and the injury has to be clear. And the examples I had given were that, for example, if you had a prior accident and you injured that same part of your body in a prior accident, that's going to make this a question, and that's going to reduce the value of your case because the defendants are going to say, well, that prior accident is why you have this injury, and it's not from this particular case, it's from that case. Or if you have an underlying medical condition, people call it a pre-existing medical condition. That term gets thrown around too. But if there's something that the defendants can point to say, oh, this injury wasn't caused by this accident, it's because the person has diabetes, or because they were a smoker, or because they have this disease, or they have this problem, they take this medication. So if there are issues that are going to make the connection between the accident and the injury an issue, that's going to decrease what your case is worth, and it's going to decrease the value. So these are the concepts that we discussed for the question of how strong is your evidence. And in the next video, we're going to talk about precedent, which is other similar cases. And those two combined will give you a much better idea of the question that you ask yourself, what is my case worth, you'll have all the information you need, or at least a lot of it. So that's it for part one of What's Your Case Worth. We covered the evidence and the strength of the evidence and all the elements. In the next video, we're going to talk about how do we put a number on this, and we look at precedent. I'll explain what that is. So take a look at the next video. I'm sure you'll find it interesting. Thanks for watching this video. I'm Jeff Kimmel, managing partner of the firm, and I'll see you in the next video. Consider us your family lawyers for all your legal needs. If we can't help you, we'll find someone who can. We have a large network of lawyers who we know and trust. Don't just call anyone. Contact us at 800-675-8556 or visit our website at www.sskblaw.com.